The hour had grown late, and the kitchen was draped in a heavy stillness. A quiet so profound it almost seemed unnatural. Like the world itself had momentarily paused. The only sound that broke the silence was the soft, rhythmic hum of the fridge. Its low drone filling the empty space like the hesitant breath of someone trying to keep still. I had just finished my usual evening routine, stacking the dishes neatly, wiping down the counters with practiced motions, making sure everything was put in its place, all the way down to the smallest details. There was something strangely comforting about the predictability of it all. A sense of order in the mundane that brought a quiet peace to the end of my day. But that night, even the familiar was off. It felt different somehow, as though something had subtly shifted. I moved toward the light switch, ready to end the day. But just as my fingers brushed the edge of the switch, I felt it, an almost imperceptible change in the air. A shift. A presence. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. My pulse quickened, a sudden flutter of unease tightening in my chest. I turned sharply, expecting to find the kitchen empty, as it always was at this hour. But instead, my eyes locked onto something that made my breath catch in my throat. A man, tall, silent, and utterly still, was standing in the doorway. His figure was an eerie silhouette against the dim hallway light, and his presence felt as though it had materialized out of nowhere. His face was a mask, unreadable, but his eyes, those eyes, pierced through the dimness, cold and intense, as though they were pulling something from the very depths of my being. I didn't know him. I'd never seen him before. And yet, there he stood, unmoving, watching. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to think clearly. The air between us felt thick, charged, as if we were both waiting for something, though I couldn't say what. A shiver ran down my spine, but I forced myself to break the silence. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said, his voice smooth and unexpectedly warm, carrying a lightness that caught me off guard. It didn't quite match the intensity in his eyes, and yet there was something reassuring in the tone, like a flicker of humanity amidst the strangeness of the moment. His appearance was casual, jeans, a jacket. Nothing remarkable, but there was something unsettlingly out of place about him. Something that made me feel as if he didn't belong here, in my kitchen, at this hour. I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something I didn't. "Oh, no worries," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could feel the rapid beat of my heart betraying me. "Didn't hear you come in. I thought I was alone." He smirked, as if he could sense the unease in my voice. And for a brief moment, I wondered if he found it amusing. But he didn't say anything further. He just stood there, watching me, his eyes never leaving my face, as though waiting for something, testing me, or perhaps observing me in ways I couldn't comprehend. The silence between us stretched, thick and palpable. I fumbled for something to break it, a way to fill the space that was growing heavier with every passing second. "You, want something to eat?" The offer slipped out before I had a chance to think about it, and I immediately felt ridiculous. Who offers food to a complete stranger who just appeared in their kitchen at this hour? But somehow, the words had already been spoken, and I couldn't take them back. He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It was a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. But it was there. All the same. "Sure. Why not?" he said. His tone almost indifferent. Yet there was a strange weight behind it. I turned back to the fridge, pulling out some random ingredients. His eyes, however, never left me, following my every movement with an intensity that made my skin prickle. It wasn't just that he was watching me, it was the way he was watching me. Like he could see something beneath the surface. Something I wasn't even aware of myself. That strange familiarity in his gaze mixed with something darker. Something elusive. I busied myself with the task of preparing food, hoping the rhythmic motion of chopping and stirring might help me regain some sense of control. But it didn't. If anything, it only heightened my awareness of him. His presence. Like an invisible force pressing in from all sides. "So," I began, my voice slightly strained as I forced myself to speak. "What brings you here?" He paused for a moment, as if considering my question carefully. Before replying, got a little lost on the way. "I suppose." The words were light, almost playful. But there was something in his tone, something hidden beneath the surface, that made me feel like there was more to his story than he was letting on. The conversation flowed from there. But it never quite felt normal. There was always this undercurrent of mystery. Something unsaid but deeply felt. The way he looked at me. The subtle pauses in his speech. It was as if he expected me to understand something I couldn't quite grasp. And that left me unnerved in a way I couldn't explain. The kitchen, once a place of routine and comfort, now felt charged with a strange energy. As though every movement had been heightened. Every word amplified. I became acutely aware of the way he leaned just a little too close whenever he spoke. The warmth of his arm brushing mine as he reached for a spoon. There was an almost tangible tension between us. Thick and electric. Building with every passing moment. I couldn't help but feel drawn to him. Caught in something magnetic. Something I couldn't resist. Even though part of me wanted to. The more I tried to ignore it, the more undeniable it became. Our laughter, though easy, held a tension I couldn't shake. There was a quiet understanding between us. An unspoken awareness of the current that ran just below the surface. His gaze lingered a little too long. His words carrying a weight that suggested we both knew something that neither of us had the courage to name. It was thrilling and unnerving. Like standing on the edge of a precipice. Unsure whether to take the step forward or retreat back to safety. At some point, he reached for the knife I was holding. His fingers grazing mine in a gesture that sent an unexpected shiver through me. "Here. Let me do that," he murmured. His voice low and intimate. So close that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin. The simplicity of the gesture caught me off guard. And yet, there was something profoundly intimate about it. As if in that small act, he had shifted the balance between us. Without thinking, I stepped aside. And he began chopping with quiet confidence. Each movement precise and deliberate. As if he had done this 1,000 times before. I stood there, watching him, unable to look away. There was something mesmerizing about the way he moved, so calm, so assured, and it made me feel oddly unsteady. Like I was losing myself in the rhythm of his actions. We fell into a companionable silence. The only sound the soft chop of the knife against the cutting board. But even in the quiet, I could feel the pull between us. An invisible thread that seemed to draw us closer with every passing moment. I leaned against the counter, feeling the weight of his presence beside me. And for a moment, I thought we were in a place beyond time. A moment suspended between past and future. Then, just as I thought I had regained my bearings, he looked up, his gaze meeting mine in a way that made my heart skip. There was something almost predatory in the way he held my gaze, as though he was waiting for me to crack, to reveal something hidden deep within. But instead of breaking the silence, he simply smiled, just a small, almost imperceptible curve of his lips that sent a shiver down my spine. "There's something about this place," he murmured, almost to himself. "Feels familiar." His words hung in the air like a question I couldn't answer, thick with a meaning I couldn't grasp. The intensity of his gaze made it feel as though we were sharing a secret, something profound and yet unspeakable. I wanted to ask him what he meant, to dig deeper, but the words stuck in my throat. Whatever it was, whatever he was implying, I couldn't quite bring myself to confront it. Not yet. The days after that night began to blur together, folding into one another in ways I couldn't explain. It wasn't as though we had planned to meet again, but somehow, he seemed to appear when I least expected it, as if he had been waiting for the exact moment to reappear. I found myself anticipating his presence, the sound of his voice, the scrape of a chair as he settled into the space next to me. And those eyes, always those eyes, meeting mine in a way that made my pulse quicken. It was unsettling, thrilling, and terrifying all at once. And no matter how hard I tried to deny it, I knew I was caught. We both were. Neither of us dared to speak it. It clung to me, this feeling I carried like a secret, one I couldn't quite grasp and didn't know how to share with anyone. It was as if it existed in the spaces between words, in the moments that hung heavy with unspoken understanding. And perhaps that was what made it so intoxicating, the secrecy, the unspoken thrill that lingered in the air. It was there, in the way he looked at me, his gaze both intense and fleeting, and in the small, almost accidental touches that brushed against me, each one leaving me breathless, a little unsteady on my feet. One evening, as the day was winding down and I was preparing to close up, he appeared again. I hadn't expected it, hadn't even known I was waiting for him, but there he was. He stood in the doorway, casually leaning against the frame, his figure barely visible in the low, golden kitchen light. The sight of him, so familiar yet somehow still new, made my heart stutter painfully in my chest. It was the way he moved, the way his very presence seemed to infuse the space with something charged, as if every motion, every glance, held more meaning than could ever be expressed in words. Even the smallest gestures seemed to carry an underlying message, layers I wasn't meant to understand. But still, I couldn't stop myself from wanting to. Without a word, he stepped into the kitchen, his movements smooth and deliberate, his expression unreadable. The air between us shifted instantly, thickening with a tension that felt almost tangible. It was as though we were locked in some silent, invisible dance, each of us making careful, deliberate steps, neither of us willing to disrupt the fragile balance that seemed to bind us. I felt the weight of it pressing in around us, suffocating in its intensity, but oddly thrilling too. I looked up, our eyes meeting, and something fluttered in my stomach, an uneasy sensation that I couldn't quite place. His gaze was unwavering, quiet but intense, as though he could see right through me. For a fleeting moment, the entire world seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of us, suspended in that small kitchen. the silence stretching out between us like a thread that was both fragile and unbreakable. "So, you just keep showing up here?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness, as I tried to break the tension with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. My heart, however, was beating wildly, too fast, and I could feel the blood rushing to my cheeks. He didn't answer immediately, just tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving mine. "Maybe I have a reason," he said, his voice low, every syllable laden with meaning. And something about the way he spoke made my pulse quicken, as though his words were meant for me alone. A promise, an invitation, a challenge. There was a certainty in his tone, something in the way he carried himself that left no room for doubt. It was as if he was telling me something I wasn't quite ready to hear. And yet, I found myself leaning in, drawn to him in a way that defied logic. My breath caught in my throat, and I searched for something to say. But the words felt like they were slipping away from me. I didn't want to admit how much he affected me, how much I could feel his presence even when he wasn't near, but I knew he could see it. Could feel it in the way my gaze lingered on his, in the way my breath hitched whenever he was near. I wanted to pull away, to resist. But it was already too late. I knew, deep down, that I was falling for him, trapped in a current I didn't know how to escape. But before I could voice anything, he took a step closer. The distance between us seemed to shrink with every movement, and his hand brushed mine, just the briefest of touches. But it sent a shiver down my spine, igniting a fire that had been smoldering under my skin for days. I felt myself instinctively leaning into him, a force drawing me closer that was as exhilarating as it was terrifying. "Why do you keep coming back?" I whispered, my voice barely audible, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the delicate moment we had created between us. He studied me for a moment, his eyes searching mine with a quiet intensity. And for a second, I thought he might pull away, that he might close himself off. But instead, he leaned in even further, his breath warm against my skin. "Maybe I'm waiting for you to let me in," he murmured, his words slipping from his lips like a secret meant only for me. The promise in his voice was enough to leave me breathless, my heart racing in my chest. There was something undeniably magnetic about him, a pull I couldn't explain, a yearning I couldn't ignore. I wanted more, needed more, yet at the same time, I was afraid of what that might mean, afraid of where this connection could take us. The air around us seemed to hum with desire, a tension that had been building for days, maybe even weeks. It was as if everything in the world had conspired to bring us to this moment. And I could feel the delicate thread between us on the verge of snapping, the anticipation thick in the air. But just as I was about to let go, to let myself fall into him completely, a sudden sound cut through the silence, shattering the fragile moment like glass. We both froze, our eyes meeting in a shared look of surprise and confusion. And the spell that had been woven between us was broken. He stepped back almost imperceptibly, the shift in the air between us immediate and unsettling. I could see it in his eyes, the way they darkened, the tightening of his jaw, as though he were struggling to regain control of something he didn't want to face. The warmth that had simmered between us cooled instantly, replaced by a coldness that I couldn't understand. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something had shifted, something I couldn't quite reach. And it left me feeling more vulnerable than I had ever felt before. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper. But he didn't answer. His expression was unreadable, distant, For a brief, terrifying moment, I thought I saw fear in his eyes, a fear that mirrored my own. I reached out instinctively, wanting to bridge the gap, to pull him back from whatever darkness was closing in around him. But he stepped away from me, the space between us growing wider with every passing second. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice so quiet it was almost lost in the silence. And in that moment, I realized that there was more to him than I had ever known, layers of history, of pain, of things I hadn't even begun to understand. He turned to leave, his movements tense, as if he were being drawn away by something I couldn't see, an invisible force pulling him from me. As he reached the doorway, he paused, his hand lingering on the frame. For a fleeting second, I thought he might turn back, might stay, might finally let me in. But then he didn't. Without another word, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving me standing alone in the empty kitchen, the silence pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. As I stood there, the echoes of our time together hanging in the air, I realized that whatever had begun between us was far from over. It wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. And deep down, I knew I was already in too deep, tangled in emotions I couldn't understand. I knew that he would be back, that this wasn't the last time our paths would cross. He would always be there, just beyond my reach, waiting for me to step into the unknown with him. I leaned against the counter, staring into the empty space where he had been, and made a silent promise to myself. No matter what it took, I would find a way to understand him, to uncover the mystery that lay hidden behind those dark, unreadable eyes. But I knew, as I stood there alone, that it wouldn't be easy. It had been days since that charged evening in the kitchen, and yet the memory of him lingered like a shadow, impossible to shake. The intensity of his gaze, the way it pierced through the quiet of the room, the silence between us that spoke volumes, all of it haunted me. Every time I entered the kitchen, I half expected to see him standing there, leaning against the counter as he often did, watching me with that quiet, almost otherworldly intensity. It was a look that had come to feel like a strange comfort and a thrilling mystery, pulling me into a world where only he and I existed. And then, one night, it happened. He was there. I hadn't heard him come in, hadn't sensed the subtle shift in the air that always preceded his presence. I turned around, and there he was, standing just a few feet away. His expression was as unreadable as ever, his eyes fixed on me with that same quiet intensity that had begun to feel like a familiar weight, one I couldn't avoid even if I tried. For a heartbeat, the world outside that kitchen ceased to exist. Time, too, seemed to slow, as if the universe itself had suspended its rhythm just for us. The air between us thickened, charged with the unspoken. And in that moment, I couldn't help but wonder if the silence would ever break, if the tension between us would ever give way to something more. "I thought you weren't coming back," I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. But somehow he heard them. His gaze softened, and for the briefest of moments, I thought I saw something in his eyes, something raw and unspoken. A fleeting vulnerability. As though, just for that instant, he had let his guard down, allowing me a glimpse into the fortress he so carefully constructed around himself. A small step, and then another. He closed the distance between us. And with each step, I could feel the warmth radiating from him. A quiet energy that seemed to pull me in, compelling me to let go, to stop fighting the inevitable. There was something different about him tonight. His usual impenetrable exterior had slipped away, revealing a softness that was both unexpected and disarming. His hand, gentle but deliberate, reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from my face. The touch, so light, so tender, caught me off guard. There was a quiet intensity in it, a hesitation, almost as though he feared I might pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, frozen in that moment, my breath catching in my throat as his fingers lightly grazed my skin. The sensation was electric, sending a shiver through me that left me breathless. He was different tonight. I could feel it. The vulnerability in his touch. The way he seemed to be unraveling before me in a way he never had before. He wasn't just here physically, he was allowing himself to be present emotionally. To let me see past the walls he had so carefully built around himself. I looked up into his eyes. And for a moment, we were suspended in time. Two souls connected in a silence so profound it felt like an unspoken promise. The warmth of his hand lingered on my cheek, his fingers brushing my skin with the gentlest of touches. And in that moment, I knew, without a doubt, that what was happening between us was real. It wasn't just a passing moment or an impulsive act. It was something deeper. Something neither of us had expected but both of us had been quietly yearning for. Without a word, he leaned in, and his lips met mine in a kiss that was soft, tentative, almost as if he were testing the waters, waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I leaned into him, my arms instinctively wrapping around his shoulders, feeling the tension melt away as our bodies pressed closer. The world outside the kitchen, the noise, the distractions, everything faded into the background, leaving only the warmth of his body and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against mine. There was something tender, almost reverent, in the way he held me, as though I were something fragile, something to be cherished. The way he kissed me was different too, gentle, almost as if he feared breaking something delicate, yet filled with a quiet longing that made my heart race. It was a feeling I hadn't expected, yet it felt so natural, so right. It was as though, in his arms, I was exactly where I was meant to be. His hands found mine, intertwining our fingers as if to anchor us in the moment. He pulled me closer, deepening the kiss. And in that instant, something shifted between us. I could feel the intensity of our connection. A bond that went beyond words, beyond explanation. It was as though we had discovered something in each other, something we hadn't even realized we were searching for. We swayed together, our bodies moving in a rhythm that was both familiar and entirely new. It was as if we were two halves of a whole, finally coming together in the most natural way. His touch was both gentle and firm, grounding me in the present moment, while his lips, now more urgent, moved against mine. With each touch, each kiss, I felt the quiet strength in him, the vulnerability he had allowed me to see. And it left me breathless. We didn't speak, because there was no need. Everything we felt, everything we wanted to say, was conveyed in the silence between us, the soft brush of our lips, the warmth of his hands as they held mine, the way our bodies fit together as if they had always been meant to. There was no room for doubt in that moment. All that mattered was the connection between us. Raw and unspoken, yet perfectly clear. As we stood there, caught in each other's arms, The world outside became a distant memory. Time seemed to stretch, slipping by unnoticed as we simply existed in that space. In that moment, together, there was a peace that settled over me. A quiet joy that filled the empty places within me. A joy I hadn't known I was missing. His lips brushed against my cheek, soft and light, sending a wave of warmth spreading through my entire being. I felt as though I had found something I never knew I needed. Something rare. Something beautiful. As he pulled me closer, I knew with quiet certainty that this was where I was meant to be. With him. In this moment. Forever etched into my memory. The world outside, with all its chaos, faded into nothingness. And I realized, for the first time in a long time, that I had found something worth holding on to. We stayed like that, moving in slow, languid circles in the soft light of the kitchen. The silence was no longer heavy, it was peaceful, filled with a sense of shared understanding that transcended words. Each gentle kiss, each tender touch, was a promise, a silent vow we had made to each other. A vow that needed no words to be understood. Everything we felt was in the space between us. In the warmth of his touch. In the rhythm of our breathing. It was as if we were communicating without speaking. Each kiss. Each caress. A language all our own. And as the night wore on, we remained in each other's arms. The world outside forgotten. The quiet joy that filled me now was something profound. Something sacred. I had found something real. Something I would hold on to forever. Whatever the future held. Whatever challenges awaited us. I knew we would face them together. It was a promise. A vow I could feel in every beat of my heart. The world outside was quiet. But within the warmth of that kitchen, with him by my side, I knew I had found something rare. Something worth cherishing for the rest of my life. We stayed like that, wrapped in each other's arms. Our hearts beating in perfect synchrony. The minutes slipped by unnoticed. Each second a quiet testament to the bond between us. A bond that didn't need words to be understood. As time passed, I knew, deep in my soul, that whatever challenges the future held, we would face them together, side by side. It was a connection that transcended anything I had ever known. A warmth that surrounded us both, binding us in a way that felt delicate yet unbreakable. And as the first light of dawn began to creep into the kitchen, casting a soft and tender glow over the space, I felt an overwhelming certainty. I had found something far beyond logic. Beyond any explanation, a love that was steadfast, unshakable, and beyond reason. It was an unspoken promise. A quiet peace that settled over me, filling me with a joy that would stay with me long after the night had come to an end. In the days that followed that night, something subtle had shifted within me. It was as though the world had transformed in the most imperceptible way. Everything was the same, yet somehow different. I moved through each day with a newfound calm. A sense of contentment that lingered long after he had gone. It wasn't just the moments we shared, but the weight of them. The way they left a lasting imprint on my spirit. Still, beneath the calm, there was an undercurrent of something else. A feeling of anticipation. A quiet longing for something I couldn't name. He didn't come by every day. His visits were sporadic, appearing at unexpected moments. Like a fleeting dream I could never quite hold on to. Yet each time he walked through the door, it was as if the world stopped for a moment. Everything felt right. Complete. His presence brought with it that same unspoken energy. That intensity that seemed to fill every corner of the room the moment he entered. It was as if he had become a part of me, woven so deeply into the fabric of my life that his absence, though only temporary, left a space that no one else could fill. One evening, I found myself alone in the kitchen, lost in thought, reflecting on the quiet intimacy we had shared, the moments when time seemed to stand still. The way he looked at me as if I were the only person in the world. His gaze holding more meaning than words could ever express. Just as I was on the verge of losing myself in these thoughts, I felt it, a subtle shift in the air. An almost imperceptible feeling that he was near. I turned. And there he was, standing in the doorway. His presence filling the room with an inexplicable warmth. His expression was softer than I had ever seen it. Almost as though he were letting me into a deeper part of himself. A part he rarely showed. Without a word, he moved toward me. The distance between us closing in a way that felt both inevitable and extraordinary. As though this moment had been written long before either of us had ever realized. His hand reached out, brushing gently along my arm. And I felt a warmth spread through me. A quiet joy that left me breathless. "You're here," I whispered, the words escaping my lips before I could stop them. He smiled. A tender, almost wistful expression crossing his face. "Always," he replied, his voice low, as though it were a secret shared between us alone. In that moment, the world outside seemed to fade away. And we were the only two people left. It felt as though we had created our own space. A world in which nothing else mattered but us. We moved together through the kitchen. Our movements synchronized. A rhythm we had unknowingly perfected over time. As we shared these small, quiet moments, I began to realize just how deeply he had become embedded in my life. It was in the little things, the way his hand would find mine when we passed each other. The soft smiles we exchanged. The silent understanding that passed between us without a single word being spoken. It was a connection that filled the air with a warmth I never knew was possible. A bond that seemed to deepen with every passing second. But tonight, something felt different. There was an unspoken heaviness in the air. A quiet tension that lingered between us. It was as if there was something he wanted to say but couldn't quite bring himself to. I could sense it in the way his movements had slowed. The way his eyes lingered on me, studying me as if trying to find the words he had been holding back. The space between us felt charged. And I reached out, my fingers grazing his arm. His gaze met mine. And for a moment, the world seemed to pause. There was a vulnerability in his eyes. A softness I had never seen before. It took my breath away. It felt as though we were standing on the edge of something raw and real. Something we couldn't take back once it had been said. "Is everything okay?" I asked softly, my voice barely a whisper. But he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took my hand and gently led me to the small table by the window, where the soft glow of the streetlights outside bathed us in a warm, golden light. He sat down first, his expression pensive, as if weighing the words he was about to say. I could feel my heart begin to race. The silence between us thick with anticipation. It was as though he was preparing to share a part of himself. A piece of his past that he had kept hidden for so long. "There's something you should know," he began, his voice low, carrying a weight of emotion I hadn't expected. The room seemed to close in around us as I waited. My breath caught in my chest. I could see the flicker of memories behind his eyes. The shadow of a life I had never known. And as he spoke, I realized just how much I didn't understand about him, the struggles, the victories, the heartache that had shaped him into the person sitting before me. His voice remained steady, though it was tinged with an emotion I had never heard from him before. A quiet intensity that made every word feel important. He shared with me the pieces of his life I had never known, his resilience, the battles he had fought, the losses that had left deep scars on his soul. As he spoke, I felt the bond between us deepen, no longer just based on the warmth and comfort we had shared, but now rooted in something much stronger: vulnerability, truth, and trust. When he finished, a heavy silence fell over us. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but one filled with a depth that words could never capture. I reached out and placed my hand over his, and he met my gaze with a look of quiet gratitude. His eyes filled with a raw sincerity that grounded me in ways I couldn't describe. We sat there for what felt like hours, the world outside fading into insignificance as we shared this moment. Eventually, he looked up at me, his expression softer than before, his eyes holding a warmth that seemed to wrap around me, filling every empty space in my heart. He squeezed my hand gently, and it felt like a promise, unspoken, yet understood. In that moment, I realized that whatever lay ahead, whatever the future held for us, we would face it together. There was no need for grand promises or declarations. No need for elaborate gestures. Everything we felt, everything we needed to say, was already in the silence, in the quiet moments we shared, in the unspoken connection that bound us together. As the night drew to a close, we remained in each other's presence, our hearts beating as one. When the first light of dawn finally crept into the room, casting a soft, golden glow over us, I felt a quiet hope rise within me, a joy that would stay with me long after the night had passed. He stood up then, pulling me to my feet, his hand lingering in mine as we exchanged a silent smile. It was a look that held everything we couldn't say, a moment of understanding that needed no words. We stepped into the morning together, our hands intertwined, and I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a certainty that whatever the future held, we would face it side by side. As we walked together into the new day, I felt a quiet joy, a sense of fulfillment that I had never known before. It was a feeling that was beyond words, a connection that filled the empty spaces in my heart. And as I looked at him, I knew, with every fiber of my being, that we had found something rare and precious, a love that would carry us through whatever challenges lay ahead. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you can join me in discovering many exciting things in the upcoming videos.